Okay, it's in your hands, Kenneth.
I'm here with Joe Horowitz, and we've been chewing the fat, getting ready to start this long overdue podcast. Joe, you've got a new essay which is going to be running on your blog this week about the state of the modern orchestra and um, the strengths and weaknesses of orchestras in America versus the wider world and different epochs. Tell us a little bit about what you've written and what prompted you to write it.
It's hard to tell you a little bit. What prompted me to write it is my frustration with the violinists in the New York Philharmonic who are faceless. And I discover at Carnegie Hall, the visiting American orchestras, the big names, the Boston Symphony, the Chicago Symphony, the Cleveland Orchestra, this problem seems to be chronic. Then I had a epiphany. I was at the Steinbach Mahler Festival and heard the Wiener Theatermusiker. And this is a group that plays in the gemütlich Strauss-Lehar idiom. The musicians are very versatile. They also play jazz. The concertmistress is the concertmistress of the Wiener Volksoper. The guy who formed this group is the former principal second violinist of the Wiener Volksoper. The trumpeter comes from the Wiener Volksoper. And my epiphany took many forms, one of which was I've never really heard those solos in Heldenleben played adequately. It should be a tour de force. I mean, he's having this violinist describe his ditzy wife. And this should be a fantastic opportunity for caricature and characterization, but it never is. This woman, who's the concertmistress for the Volksoper, she would make this an unforgettable musical vignette. And then I talked to Teo, who he told me many things. The guy who created this group, who's the former principal second violinist in the Volksoper Orchestra, he's now, rather elderly, said it was a great job because he controlled the rhythm. When they played waltzes, he was the guy who kicked the second beat, and he was the guy who controlled the rhythmic trajectory and complexion of the performance. And then he said, we're losing touch with this tradition in Vienna. And I thought, Jesus, I mean, we've lost it in the US, but I thought in Vienna. And he said, no, it's a problem with string players. That the brass and winds have experience playing in bands. But the string players are now susceptible to a, quote, international style taught by an international faculty, and they don't know how to play a waltz. Then I had another thought. My favorite, and this is the last thing I'll say, my favorite conductor of the Blue Danube Waltz happens to be Joseph Krips with the Wiener Philharmonic. Krips is also my favorite conductor of the Schubert Ninth Symphony, and this is not a coincidence. So you put all of this together, and we're describing an erosion of style and tradition that's, of course, hitting first in the U.S. Uh, and it's happened. I mean, I feel as if there's this kind of reckoning moment that I predicted in Understanding Toscanini in 1987, and here we are in 2026, and it's happening. We're so losing touch with this music and the traditions that inform it that we can no longer play it. I wrote one sentence that in this rant is that I think I observe among these young violinists diminished motivation, as if the music fails to impel a commanding physical and emotional response. So that's what I'm thinking.
I think what you are describing from someone at the pointy end of these issues, I mean, there are roots of it in so many parts of our musical culture that it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed by it. I remember maybe 15 years ago, I was guest conducting one of the top American youth orchestras. And as is, the case with groups like that these days, these are super high achieving young people, mostly from pretty affluent families. They're playing on fantastic violins and cellos. They're studying with very revered and expensive teachers. They're going to summer festivals to practice even more. And we were doing Sibelius' Second Symphony. And in the midst of this, I very quickly realized that out of 100 kids, maybe three had actually listened to the Sibelius at least often enough to recognize the piece from something other than, say, like the big tune in the last movement. And so the whole of their training and their experience as musicians is divorced from listening. And the motivation is about being good at your instrument as opposed to sharing the music with other people. And in fact, the whole idea of like that you have something to say with the music kind of is antithetical to that approach to music as a measure of pure excellence. In other words, if someone is auditioning for an orchestra job, you want to have the most objective criteria you possibly can for, how perfect is their rhythm, how perfect is their intonation. And, you talk about a Strauss waltz. I mean, half the rhythms, if they're done right, are unnotatable, you know,
Right.
and and most of the people on the panels, well, I wouldn't want to say most, but many people on the panels haven't engaged with that tradition themselves very deeply. So, they don't know the traditions and the whimsy and the character either. So it just becomes about this incredible pursuit of a very narrowly defined idea of excellence, as in not making mistakes, not giving anyone anything to criticize. But then when you step back and think about it, you think, well, but then what's the point? It's just an empty vessel if we don't have things to say. And um, if you've got young musicians who can go through a whole term playing a Sibelius symphony without really actually knowing the piece, they're practicing their violin part or their flute part, but they're not listening to it outside. They're not engaged with, where that music comes from or where it led to. When they actually perform the piece, they're really only performing their individual part as opposed to, you know, what we would hope for, which is that the orchestra is a vehicle of communicating a collective idea of what the music's trying to say.
And can you track this in time?
Hmm.
I've become aware of it suddenly because of something that's happened in New York
Hmm.
with a specific orchestra. Although it's the same thing is true at the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. These are both orchestras now that are very, very young,
Hmm.
very few older members, very little intergenerational continuity, and the violins just can't get it up. And one feels that they don't even realize that they're not playing. I know a conductor who will remain nameless who says he cannot get any sound out of the first violins in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, which is exactly what my ear tells me.
Hmm.
When did this happen?
Seeds of it have been sown for a long time.
Sure, but
And I think there
this
was
is,
a point in the 80s and early 90s where a lot of the major American orchestras had gotten quite geriatric, for lack of a better term. I
yeah,
remember,
yeah,
growing up going to Chicago Symphony concerts and,
yeah.
seeing, Frank Miller, have been there 150 years, and then suddenly there's been this huge sea change, and maybe with that a certain amount of, you know, when the car starts to swerve one way, you swerve too far back the other way. But I do think that whole audition mentality of not giving people something to criticize can be a problem. But there's also always been this tension in American orchestras that you're not really there to call attention to yourself, which seems like a really worthy goal. But I remember when I saw the Berlin Philharmonic for the first time in person, and everyone in the orchestra is moving, and everyone in the orchestra is breathing and imagining and communicating. I mean, it was just indisputably clear that this was a more exciting way to make music. Um, you know, and I mean, ultimately, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if the theory is that using very little bow and playing inconspicuously, but really blending as carefully as you can with your stand partner is going to get the best results, well, then, we should be able to hear that. But I think that kind of, again, that's putting this idea that somehow there's some sort of technical secret sauce of being even more flawless as opposed to actually creating excitement for the audience. Um, and I think, you can't expect the audience to be excited by very cautious playing, um, especially when the music is expressing, as it so often does, really heightened emotional states.
So the audition process has become a problem. I, in my piece, I found myself wondering if it might have been possible for the United States to acquire a style for orchestras. And the obvious question to me is one I've asked many times, which is what if Gershwin had lived as long as Copland? Uh, you hear something like an American swagger when Bernstein conducts standard repertoire, right? Which has something to do with Broadway, it's something to do with jazz. This could have gone, I mean, we don't have anything like an American style of performance. There used to be a French style of performance, a Viennese style of performance, a German style of performance, an Italian, Russian style of performance, all of which survive, to some degree. I just heard the Vienna Philharmonic in the pit at the Staatsoper, and it sounds like the Vienna Philharmonic playing Mozart. Um, but we never acquired this kind of a distinctive complexion because we didn't acquire a canon, a consolidated canon. Now, if Gershwin had lived to be 75 or 80 years old and wrote a lot of stuff for orchestra and for chamber music and for opera house, he's the guy who really could have created a performance idiom, right? That would then inflect music by others. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the tradition is not confining, it's actually liberating. I find this so true in these Mervinsky recordings with the Leningrad Philharmonic. They have a tradition, the Russian tradition. The trombones play with immense vibrato, and the trumpets sound like kazoos. But given the stylistic base, they can take it to Bruckner. They can take it to Beethoven. They can take it to Debussy. It doesn't sound like the Vienna Philharmonic playing Bruckner, but it's rooted. It's still rooted because they have their own tradition. What we're seeing now is the consequence, decades and decades later, of a failure to create an American performance tradition based in American repertoire. Yes?
Yes, I think there are other challenges that are somewhat unique to the American scene. And I think one of those is that the American orchestra as an institution, as an artistic institution, is by and large not run by artists or by artistic people. It's run by administrators and a board and run in negotiation with a union. Um, and from an artistic point of view, the players have very little input and agency, and the conductors possibly have even less. I mean, the recent Boston Symphony situation is a good example. But I would say, to a certain extent, the American model has become hamstrung because of the need to keep the customer happy, and so that means that the repertoire is not just that it's not American, but that it's very uniform across all the orchestras. Just, every restaurant's got to have a hamburger, and every orchestra's got to play a Tchaikovsky symphony every year. Now, I'm a huge, huge Tchaikovsky nut, but not every conductor is, and not every orchestra does that. And I mean, in a way, that kind of music should almost, in my view, be kind of saved for special occasions rather than just trotting it out
Oh,
as if,
wow. Yeah, what
here
a thought.
here goes another one.
Yeah.
And and that was, something that you got the feeling of with someone like Mervinsky, is that every time they went through that process of preparing a concert, it really was about trying to achieve something really extraordinary. Um, and, you know, not every concert was extraordinary, but there was definitely that sense. And there's a lot of pressure that goes with that. Um, but I think at the end of the day, you know, we've kind of gone around telling ourselves that, a good analog for the modern orchestra is like a Michelin-starred restaurant. But really, we're running it much more like TGI Fridays or any other chain restaurant, which is that it's pretty largely market driven, keep the customer happy, you know, run it soundly as a business, nothing wrong with that. But that, the relationship of, say, uh, the cooks to the food is that the cooks are told what to cook and how to serve it in the way that's going to be the most profitable for the company and the most predictable from venue to venue. And at the
So, as
moment,
a conductor, I know you were recently in Germany. How do you experience this growing gap, which I think is objectively true, between the culture of the American orchestra and the culture of the European orchestra, with all the factors that you mentioned in play, the administration, the union, the repertoire? These
yeah,
institutions are becoming increasingly dissimilar in kind. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, I think so. Um, I mean, there remains in the German model a commitment to a rehearsal process, which we don't have really in Britain. Rehearsal here is kind of treated as something between either a mark of prestige or a great luxury if you can get it, or, just exactly how much rehearsal do we really need to do this program because things here are so underfunded. And there are actually wonderful things that come out of that culture because British musicians are so unbelievably quick and do play with lots of agency and flexibility because they have to. But in Germany, they're still well funded enough that they have rehearsals, and the technical standard is very high these days. And so the upshot is that, there's an understanding that if you're there as a conductor, you're there not just to get them through the concert without it falling apart, but to actually, develop an interpretation with the musicians. At least that was certainly my impression in the process in Dortmund was that, they wanted to know what my take on this repertoire was. They wanted to work on it. They wanted to understand it. And it was a very interesting mix because the program was Brahms Violin Concerto, which they all know very, very well. And you might think, oh, maybe they'll be resistant to new ideas, but they absolutely weren't. And then the Elgar Enigma Variations, which is the most standard piece of music in Britain, but they'd never played it at all.
Mm.
And so, across a relatively luxurious span of rehearsals, it was like trying to really get into the language, the nuance, all of that kind of stuff that you're talking about with the sort of Wiener Schnitzel music of, the natural inflections, the way the music breathes, the way the music swings that makes it sound like you're speaking your native language and like makes it sound as if you understand the language that you're speaking. I mean, I think this is, really a problem for, I mean, imagine how so often with choirs you get the feeling that they're just singing the syllables. They don't actually know what the words mean. And the orchestra is, probably even less. But the same thing happens in instrumental music, that there are gestures, that, could be march rhythms that have their own symbolism, or dance rhythms that have their own symbolism. There can be, music that has its roots in Romany culture and Slavic culture and French culture, and that's exactly the sort of thing we don't teach people in music school, you know.
So what about pedagogy? Is there an opportunity here, or are we just so far distant now from these traditions and this ethos that it's almost irremediable?
I think it is in some ways perhaps slightly more fixable in the pedagogical sphere. There was definitely when I was coming up through the ranks a real hierarchy around the superstar teacher, that if you could get into Dorothy DeLay's studio,
Yeah.
then you were set for life, and there were people like that, for every instrument. There has been a massive shakeout in recent years. I mean, first of all, there's no one around like DeLay or Galamian who has that kind of power in the business anymore. I mean, there's still, you know, grandees, but no one with that kind of power. And I think part of that is because the internet has made us much more interconnected. We can kind of see um, more of the breadth of who's out there and what they have to offer. And, there has been a little bit of a sorting out of, for want of a better term, bullshit in music schools. I mean, I can remember, you know, lots of teachers at, American conservatories when I was a student be like, oh, I'm playing, 250 concerts a year and teaching you lessons. And, you get out of in the world or in a world where you can actually Google what they're doing. It's like, they're not playing 250 concerts a year. There's no way. It's just all, you know, look at me. I'm a super important person. And so I think students have more options. I mean, I still see kids being pushed into the super studio who would be happier somewhere else. I have a young violinist who I work with a little bit here who ended up, in exactly that state, but he fortunately he's escaped and hopefully on to a more nurturing teacher. And I think generally speaking, there are more open-minded teachers out there if you're lucky enough to find them. But it's still a long way to go because I think at the end of the day, you know, people are ready to be creative and investigate things until it's time to take an orchestra audition. And then, it's just, put it in a box and make sure that you're not doing any reason to not advance. You're not giving the committee any reason to get rid of you, which is uh it's not what being a musician should be about.
So you had what, 6 rehearsals for your concert in Dortmund?
I think, yeah, 5 regular rehearsals in a dress. I think that's right. Certainly more than I've had in a good while.
Was there a clock?
Oh yeah. And there is an orchestra representative who, came and said hi to me at the beginning and introduced himself. It's all quite, structured, but for instance, in the standard advice for young conductors getting ready to work with the big American professional orchestras is, don't stop the orchestra, don't talk to the orchestra, don't, you know, don't start picking on intonation or fussing with stuff. They don't like that. And I've always thought that that's way oversimplified and kind of, you know, I mean, it might get you to survive a few weeks longer, but it's not going to persuade the orchestra that you've got anything meaningful to offer. But yeah, in Germany, they're there to work, and the test is ultimately, when you stop the orchestra, can you give them something that they find useful and helpful and interesting?
So when I hear a performance of the Blue Danube Waltz by a major American orchestra that's completely flat and there's no attempt to kick the second beat, is this a failure of the conductor, a failure of the musicians? Uh, how does this happen? Is it so hard to achieve?
It's not easy, um, because you're dealing possibly with people who don't have a great deal of experience of actually listening to that repertoire. And
Okay,
again,
so you can expose them to a recording even.
yeah. But I mean, again, that's kind of goes against the grain. Like you don't want to insult your colleagues by saying, why don't you go home and listen to the Crips recording of
No,
this?
do it at a rehearsal. Just
Yeah.
play a little bit of Crips
Oh
or
yeah.
Lehar conducting Lehar and let them hear what it sounds like. I'm sure I'm suggesting something that's completely unthinkable and anathema, but
Oh
it
yeah,
seems
it
so
is completely
obvious to
understandable.
me.
I mean, I've cheated all kinds of different ways over the years with exactly this problem of like, you know, okay, so we can't do that with the orchestra, but maybe we can do an open rehearsal for an audience on that piece. And then I can say to the audience, oh, here's an old recording of the piece and play it with the orchestra standing behind me on stage, ostensibly for the benefit of the audience. But of course, everyone can hear it.
Are
Funnily
you
enough,
telling me that you actually did this or that you
yeah,
might do it? Or
yeah, I have done it. And, you
did
know,
it help?
yeah. And even sometimes you're just, in the rap from the podium or the pre-concert talk, you can just kind of sneak in a few little things about the circumstances of the piece that help. And I mean, the thing is, I really believe that the musicians on stage, 98.7% of them really want to be worthy of the music and to do great. And they are curious and they want to be inspired and they want to be inspiring, but there's the framework just doesn't really easily allow it. For years, I used to attend it at first as a student and then as a guest conductor, the Round Top Festival in Texas. And two of my most important mentors I've met there, Georgia Flazonis, the longtime concertmaster in Minnesota, and her husband, Michael Steinberg. And they would do listening nights with the members of the student orchestra there. And Michael would play historic recordings for members of the orchestra. And, you know, every single person in the orchestra wanted to be at those evenings and to listen and all of that. And it's exactly the sort of thing you can do at a festival, especially, one that's essentially an orchestral training institute. And I think that experience shaped a lot of the participants long range as musicians. And it would be great, the problem is, finding people who can speak about performance history with the kind of fluidity and charisma that Michael Steinberg had. It's a relatively small bunch of folks.
I
And
tried doing that recently at a university with a conservatory orchestra, and I feel I failed.
mm,
Um, and I certainly admire Michael Steinberg. I recently reviewed this compendium of his Boston Globe pieces, and I can imagine I've been at Round Top. In fact,
mhm.
I did a series of presentations on Mahler 9 at Round Top. I don't
Was
know if
that the
they
year
had it.
that Ben Zander did it there?
No,
No, no, no.
I have no idea if I had any impact. But I think a guided listening experience, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I can imagine certain orchestras that I've observed being receptive to that, and other orchestras that I've observed being completely unreceptive to a rehearsal in which the conductor trots out a little bit of, I don't know, Furtwängler playing Brahms or Panizza conducting Verdi. It's too bad because that could be a kind of quick fix.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the secret sauce around those Georgia and Michael evenings, in addition to their strength of personality, was just that it was um, not sold as having any educational value whatsoever. It was like, we're
Oh,
going to
how
have a party,
interesting. Oh,
you
how
know,
interesting.
yeah, and, come and have a
Yeah,
glass of wine and a piece of cake, and Michael's going to
yeah,
talk about old recordings.
yeah.
And that's something that's really hard to achieve, at a conservatory, you know, where people are like, oh, you go to the guest lectures. I said, it's not a lecture, We'll have wine, we'll have cake, it'll be great, listen to some tunes. Even at Mahlerfest, I understand absolutely why it is, because we work people very, very hard. But it does sadden me just the tiniest bit that we don't get more of the orchestra musicians able to come to more of like the symposium events and talks and stuff. Because I think they'd love it and they'd find it really, really interesting.
This is a real problem. I was with Thomas Hampson in Austria just now,
Hmm.
and it was very stimulating to talk to him about pedagogy. He said he hates it when he encounters vocal students who've been instructed by their teachers, don't listen to recordings because then
Hmm.
you'll diminish your own, personal engagement. And he's an avid discophile. I mean, he has an immense library of vocal recordings going back many, many decades. And that's so rare.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the access we have to phonograph recordings, especially of live performances, of broadcasts, is such an essential pedagogical opportunity and such an important cultural asset that's squandered.
Oh, absolutely.
And
I
now
mean,
you're telling me that if you attempt to incorporate it in a rehearsal, you're likely to antagonize the orchestra.
oh yeah.
That's
Um,
terrible. I
it
mean,
is terrible. Um,
that should never have happened.
I know, but we've kind of lost in many working scenarios a sense of common purpose and trust. And
The
that,
other thing that was I mean, this epiphany I had with the Wiener Theatermusiker, half of these musicians play jazz,
uh
and it's very pertinent to they're the performance possibilities that come into play that they've been shaken up. Uh, I'm mentioning this to you especially because you play rock guitar. And I've been listening lately to the middle movements of Dvorak's G major symphony conducted by Tallich, Honeck, Ivan Fischer, and George Sell.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, in the second movement, there's a little violin solo. And this little solo has a hint of the rustic in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can't be played clean, and yet it is. The tastiest performance is with the Hungarian festival, the Budapest Festival Orchestra, where there's, a little bit of portamento and there's just enough of an aroma of the countryside that it works. But if you play it clean, you're violating the music actually. And but once if you these guys that I heard, they're so shook up, just in general that the musical performance for them involves such a broad range of interpretive possibilities that it doesn't matter that their base is Viennese.
Mm-hmm.
They can take that attitude and, and Lexo Taradze, my late friend who was a product of the Moscow Conservatory, who would stay up at night listening to the Voice of America religiously, was the jazziest concert pianist I've ever heard. His Prokofiev was jazzy, his Rachmaninoff was jazzy, his Stravinsky was jazzy. Um, Everything he touched was jazzy, and yet he was not an American pianist. He
Yeah.
was a Russian trained pianist. And he would acknowledge that. I mean, his stylistic base was two things:
Yeah.
Russian music and American jazz. You need some kind of a stylistic base, Ken, I guess is what I'm ultimately thinking. And if you've got zero stylistic base, it's just a non-starter.
There's a lot to unpick in that, actually. To me, it's like to come back to your listening to recordings example, that part of what you're learning to listen to when you listen to lots of different performances is the language of performance. And I'm not talking about, any French or German text or anything, but, the language of how music speaks in time, how it flows, how it breathes, all of that, and how that happens differently with different musical accents. And exactly as you said about the Viennese folks, if you've spent a lot of time immersing yourself in understanding all these unwritten rules and teaching yourself and learning to accept that there is a world of fantasy around music making that's just as integral as intonation and pulse and vertical alignment and all of that stuff. That you start to, once you can kind of hear that and understand how that has its own logic and energy to it, from understanding the Viennese waltz to understanding swing is not that big a leap. And, for me, I was very excited. Like 25 years ago, I did a concert in Mexico with an orchestra that was mostly Russian, Russian emigres who'd come over. And at the end, the first four violinists and the first violins were all family. There was two parents and two kids from the
Yeah,
same family.
yeah.
And they came to me afterwards. They said, "We have to tell you, you have a Russian soul when you conduct Prokofiev. It's like Russian soul." And I loved that, but it was because, years of like listening to the Rostropoviches and the Taradzes and the Richters and, all the people who are exponents of that music who knew the composers. working on, say, a Shostakovich symphony, it's all that experience of having listened to the Borodin Quartet and the Beethoven Quartet and understanding that tradition of string playing. But, it can be very tough because you then say to an orchestra, look, you know, in this kind of music, Shostakovich would have been expecting everyone to be using full bows right on the string, like that. And people just be like, oh, but that'll sound like shit, or it won't be together, or we don't play that way. You say to the brass, this chorale should have vibrato. They're like, oh, we don't do vibrato in this country on the trumpet or the horn. And and of course, it's not really fair to expect them to learn to do vibrato in the middle of a rehearsal sequence, but it just goes to show you there's like that. If we're living in a musical world that's about narrowing what we think we can do in a performance, and coming up with reasons why not to try to do it this way or that way, to me, that's not going to excite an audience. I want to just share one quick anecdote about this too, because when you were talking about the nuance of the Viennese playing, it reminded me of my very first year at Mahlerfest. We had Kurt Schwertzik, the Viennese composer there, and Kurt had been a horn player in the Vienna Symphony for many, many years as well. So he's played all that repertoire as well as being a wonderful composer. And we were talking through Mahler 7 with the student conductors, and one of the student conductors said, Kurt, how would you describe, people say that the Schwungvoll is kind of untranslatable in American. And so Kurt, he's like, oh, Schwungvoll, yeah. And his wife was there in the room with him. She was always kind of like lurking in the back, and she's an ex-dancer. And he walked over to her and she stood up and they just started walking around the room with swing, mit Schwung.
Oh,
And, you know, all of us who watched that were like, oh, yes, and that to me, that's part of the joy of being an artist is collecting those moments of insight. And, if you just think you're going to find all that in the practice room, you just, then what are you going to tell your audience? It's lonely in the practice room.
so what happens now? Um, and how am I supposed to feel about this? Is it hopeless?
Um,
I can see it's getting worse, even as I'm being told on all sides how orchestras are better than ever. That's the conventional wisdom.
um, I mean, I think orchestras are not alone in the whole scope of valuable institutions that are under pressure in the modern world. And, on the one hand, we want to protect them, whether it's a university or a school or a hospital or an orchestra, from those modern pressures. But at the same time, you can't pretend that problems that are there aren't there. And I think we're reaching a sort of crisis point where, just putting out press releases about how great you are, um, is no longer going to fool your audience because they can go on the Berlin Philharmonic Concert Hall or go on YouTube, and many of them do, and listen to uh, much more exciting music making. Um, there may have to be a bit of a Gotterdammerung moment that gives us a chance at a reset of how orchestras are governed, what they're there for, what they're trying to achieve, and that
Okay,
part
so
of
this
that.
is happening to a degree. You can see it happening in Los Angeles. You can see it attempted in Boston. You can see it happening to a degree in New York. You see an acknowledgement that there's a systemic issue. But I cannot, alas, agree with you that the pressure is going to come from the audience. I think the audience is increasingly uninformed.
Well, I
And
think the audience, I may regret saying this out loud, but I think the audience is a big part of the problem.
of course,
And orchestras are terrified of saying that part out loud, we have, it's not their fault, it's our fault, but we have created an incurious audience that doesn't really know what to listen for or what makes something
totally.
special. So, for instance, I mean, there was some years ago, I'll try to be as vague as I can about this. A very celebrated young conductor made their televised debut on one of the PBS franchises, conducting a Mahler symphony, and it was not good. It was just not good. And but everyone who I was kind of whinging, I was like, oh, but it's just so great that it's on television and millions of people will see this, and you stop being such a curmudgeon. I said, I'm not being a curmudgeon, but if you're telling millions of people, this is it, this is as good as Mahler gets, this is the greatest Mahler conductor of our time, or the greatest Brahms conductor of our time, and it's basically pretty boring.
What one reads about Boston is A, there are a lot of empty seats, but B,
Mhm.
the people who are going are resisting change,
Yeah.
even when it's blatantly necessary. So in the Philharmonic, there's just an obvious issue of leadership. Everybody knows that the last few music directors really didn't happen, especially the last one, Jaap van Sweden,
Mhm.
was a mistake. So there's a real understanding of the problem, whether or not there's an understanding of the solution. And that's a step forward um, from just passivity. And maybe that's the most hopeful sign that we can cite, that there's a recognition that orchestras have to rethink fundaments, like what's the music director for,
Hmm.
what's the right format for a concert, how do you best engage an audience, what does music education consist of? Um, and these questions, as far as I'm aware, are now being asked more than before. It would have been nice if they had been asked in the 1980s when I wrote Understanding Toscanini and saw, the handwriting on the wall. But,
But
and
with
the
all
fact,
of that, and I know you've said this to me many, many times. It's kind of your starting point for this whole conversation. All of what you just said, I agree with. But what wasn't on that list, and what I worry isn't on the list of a lot of administrations, is actually what our performances sound like, look like, and feel like when we perform.
you
The
know,
actual music. Does the actual music making need to get better, or are we just saying, we need different kind of commissioning and better community outreach and better marketing? Or do we actually just need to play better, more interesting, more exciting concerts?
well, yes, I, I don't know that people realize that's a problem. I mean, the conventional wisdom is, I get it all the time as feedback to my various, rants. Orchestras are better than ever. It's like a mantra. It's not true. Orchestras are worse than ever. They are more perfect than ever. Okay, the Philharmonic violins play perfectly, but they're not better than ever. They're worse than ever. And I sound like a curmudgeon saying that, but it matters. I mean, and maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it only matters to very few people, but certainly there's a huge difference from past practice.
There's a story I've told many times. Here in Cardiff, for many, many years, we had the Cardiff Singer of the World
Yeah, right.
competition, which has given the world you know, Bryn Tervel and Forstovsky and any number of other great luminaries of the opera world. And the competition happens over several nights in St. David's Hall. The orchestra duties are shared between Welsh National Opera and BBC National Orchestra of Wales. And pretty much everyone who's singing is flawless and amazing and, beautiful voice and, well prepared, all of that. And yet, every once in a while in the course of the festival, someone will start singing. And by, you know, 30 seconds into that first aria, you just know that the whole building is going to explode
Yeah.
at the end of the aria. And
Yeah.
it does,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
everyone can tell, everyone in the
Yeah.
room can tell
Yeah.
that, in a situation where everyone sounds great and everyone's flawless, and then someone makes us all feel.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm really concerned that we sort of
I
are
don't think that's
almost put.
possible any longer at the Metropolitan Opera. I really don't. Even if you have a performance of that caliber, it's my experience of the audience there, which is a new audience, that they can't tell. I wish I could agree with you, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's a phenomenon that still exists, say, at Carnegie Hall,
Mhm.
but not at the Metropolitan Opera. I think the audience reaction is pretty much the same, unless, well, if they've been sold a bill of goods about a particular singer,
Well, I
it
mean,
makes a little bit of a difference, but not a big difference.
I'd come back again to my earlier point about arts organizations not being run by artists,
Yeah,
and the Met is
sure.
not artistically led. I mean,
No,
hate to
no, of
hate to
course
say
not.
that. It's not going to help me get any guest conducting there, but they haven't exactly been knocking my door down anyway. But yeah, the Met is not an artistically led organization, and in fact, they've had a historic problem that Levine, during his long tenure, did not want uh, conductors of equal stature or greater stature coming in. The exceptions were, a couple of instances of Tenstedt and Kleiber coming to town. And, but by and large, he wanted to be the great man. And so they don't have a institutional memory of, working on Wagner with really great Wagner
I
conductors.
don't think there is any, you used a term that's pertinent to this entire conversation.
Hmm.
Institutional memory. It, it's gone. I
Yeah,
mean, where is there, maybe the Cleveland Orchestra, okay,
yeah.
has some institutional memory. I don't know that Boston does or Chicago does, New York does. The Met certainly doesn't. The whole larger question of cultural memory for me is the most important concept in understanding the erosion of the arts. It's the erosion of cultural memory. And you're not talking about a very important component of cultural memory, institutional memory. When you
Yeah.
have such turnover and predominantly young membership, and also a huge turnover in audience, how can you have an institution without a memory? And that the attempt isn't even being made. I mean, the Philharmonic will never remember Anton Seidel. The Boston Symphony will never remember Kusevitsky. The Met will never remember Ettore Panizza or Artur Bodansky. Uh, there's not even a gesture towards institutional memory. I'm sure this is not equally the case abroad.
No, I wouldn't think that it is, but I think, I mean, it's more of a problem everywhere. I mean, I think in terms of the workings of orchestras, by and large, I think if we created atmospheres in which conductors and musicians uh, felt safer with each other and more unified in their commitment to the, you know, shared result, I think things could improve very quickly. I think that's one thing that player-run orchestras like Vienna and the LSO and Berlin have right is is that. But then the flip side of that is you look at relationships between conductors and orchestras like Ivan Fischer and the Budapest Festival Orchestra or Nicholas Harnoncourt with Concertus Musicus, um, where having a single really strong musical leader actually is empowering for everyone, and that becomes a big part of the institutional memory, of the cultural memory of the organization. And right now I feel like a lot of orchestras want to keep their conductors at arm's length. I mean, this Philharmonic is a good example of that, that they've not had a really memorable, strong, long-standing relationship with a conductor in many, many years. Um, and and I think that's part of why the Cleveland Orchestra might have more of that, because they had very strong, long-running, deep collaborations with both Zell and Dohnányi, that I think helped build that. I think that can be rebuilt, and I think the problem with what you're talking about in terms of like sharing the history of the institution on a deeper level is that orchestras as institutions don't really know how to talk about music in a way that isn't all sort of hyperbole and marketing speak. How do you really get people? I mean, it just very quickly turns into, Anton Seidel was a great, great conductor who did great, great things and all this. And, it's, we need, advocates who know enough about the history that there's some texture to the history. And I mean, it's one of the things when you and I have talked about people like Seidel in the past, like, you know, that sense of what the atmosphere around him and his work was at that time, the level of interest in the public, how they responded, what he was trying to do, all that kind of stuff. Then you start to say, okay, well, this isn't just like generically fantastic conductor, but kind of a phenomenon that people would be, you know, amazed if it was happening today.
Well, we both seem to be saying the same thing, and we're outnumbered.
Yeah, but I think sooner or later, I worry
I
that
had a
part
really
of the problem, I'm dithering here, but the issue in America also has to do with the fact that these institutions are so huge. There's so much money and so much prestige and political will and social capital invested in them that, the thought that they could fundamentally change or realign or be reimagined is, terrifying to the stakeholders. But at the end of the day, can we really justify in artistic terms the cost of these institutions when, it's hard to sort of say in the 21st century an initiative of, let's say if we take the top five biggest budget performing arts organizations in America, have any of those organizations really done something in the last 25 years that was at the absolute forefront of artistic importance and innovation? I can't think of one at the moment.
so I find myself happy at the Colorado Mahler Fest, at the Mahler Festival in Steinbach, and at the South Dakota Symphony. And the musicians seem happy. The audiences seem happy. They're scholarly participants. Um, and the people in charge, like yourself or David Geyer or Morton Solvik and Steinbach, they're certainly not chasing fashion or prestige or glamour. Of course, these are institutions that work partly because they're small, but they also work because of the attitude of the individuals in charge. Uh, for one thing, they really care. They're not here today and gone tomorrow. There's a sense of shared commitment. The audience feels it, the musicians feel it, the people who are administering these institutions feel it. So I guess the ultimate question is whether this model is expandable. Why can't you have a large orchestra like the South Dakota Symphony? Why can't you have a large festival? I just talked to somebody, so many things that I could tell you I shouldn't say, right? But I was talking to somebody about a very prestigious American festival. And he'd been there and I hadn't. And he said that the audience was very open-minded. And isn't that great? And I said, did they get it? He said, no, no, they're just very open-minded. Whereas when you do something, uh, when Morton presents the Wiener Theatermusiker, when we do Shostakovich 7 or 8 in Sioux Falls, the audience gets it. I mean, there's no question about it. It's not pro forma. Uh, there's a sense of shared experience, partly because of the way the experiences have been set up. Uh, there's an attempt to educate, contextualize, and crucially, the problem we've been talking about for the past hour, which has to do with the motivation of musicians in an orchestra, does not exist. I can I'm in the habit, as you are perhaps, of looking at the bodies and faces of orchestral musicians. You don't even have to hear them. An extreme example, which you already mentioned, is the Berlin Philharmonic of an engaged orchestra. So you have an engaged orchestra. David has an engaged orchestra in Sioux Falls. Uh, the orchestra that I saw in Steinbach, the Bruckner Orchestra from Linz, population 215,000, in 100-degree heat, was an engaged orchestra playing Mahler 3. So there's something like a template here, Ken. It may be that it's just not a very sexy template, right? It's not a very glamorous template, but it's a functional template.
Yeah. Well, I completely
Maybe
agree.
that's the most interesting thing that I've stumbled into in this conversation with you. That's a template that could actually be applied in Cleveland or Chicago or Boston, New York, but you'd have to forego certain expectations that have to do with glamour and fashion. Uh, I don't know if that is a useful pipe dream or not. Is that a useful pipe dream?
I think it is useful, and I don't think it has to be a pipe dream. I mean, I think, to come back to Berlin's example, when Petrenko was appointed, there was so much skepticism because, he wasn't considered a star at that point. Um, and, people seem to be scratching their heads. Why would they just pick him because he's a really good conductor? He needs to be able to do media and all of this. Of course, it's proven to be an incredible success. And, people go to those concerts because they know that the musicians love playing for him and that, there's always going to be some extra level of intensity there. And, he's not, no one's a perfect musician. He's got repertoire that he's better in and not as amazing in and all of that. But that combination that, they want to work with him. He wants to work with them. This is the music they want to play. They're going to play it
So this was a
as well as
decision
possible.
made on the basis of competence rather than reputation.
Absolutely.
Now, can that happen in an American orchestra? There's such a pressure to pick the guy. The most extreme example is when Kusevitsky was ignored by the Board of Trustees in 49, which I wrote about. Why did the Boston Symphony trustees not choose Leonard Bernstein rather than Charles Munch when he was you know, Kusevitsky's protege? It's very explicit in the minutes, in the private correspondence, that they wanted a pedigreed European conductor. They were first and foremost looking for reputation and
Yeah.
probably thinking at the same time that it would be good for the orchestra, good for the institution, good for the audience. I mean, they figured that it would ramify.
Hmm.
But reputation was the first criterion. And when Petrenko was chosen, it was not.
Yeah. I think that can happen. Um, I can give one really encouraging example to finish up with, which is I spent 1 year as a sort of, assistant conductor on the staff at the Cincinnati Symphony, where I just basically watched other people rehearsed and tried to be
Yeah.
helpful and all of that as we do. And that was at the end of Jesus Lopez Cobos' tenure as music director, and they were just getting ready to start a music director search. To
Yeah.
their credit, the orchestra at that point was quite a conservative organization. Um, and so I was pleasantly surprised when they said, we really want the musicians to take the lead in this search process. And so one thing they did was they said, we want everyone in the orchestra
Mm.
to, say, who do you think we should be looking at? Even if it's Claudio Abbado, who was still alive, that,
Yeah.
just give us your wish list. And they ended
Yeah.
up with a list of about 200 conductors that,
Yeah.
were theoretically possible
Yeah.
music director candidates. Not long after that exercise, a young unknown guest conductor came in, and who was not on that list. Not a single person had thought of them as a possible candidate. And by the end of the first half of the first rehearsal, musicians were backstage going, I wonder if this could be our guy. And by the end of the week, he'd been re-engaged for a follow-up concert. And after the follow-up concert, they gave him the job. It was Pavel Yervi, who, has since become like the most famous guy in the world. But at that point, he had a famous last name, but no one had him on the radar. And that really transformed that whole organization because he was able to come in with a mandate from the musicians. They were really excited to have him there. And, it made for a change in the working culture of the orchestra to something that was much more electric and energetic and exciting. And I mean, I just wish more orchestras would, really let the musicians see lots of people and have lots of say. They won't always get it right either, but that was an encouraging example that, all of those walls around name recognition and profile and track record just went out the window, and people were like, the orchestra loves him. They sound amazing with him. Let's get him.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, well, here we are.
Here we are. We fight on. Um, yeah. Well, we'll see what the future brings. But great as always to talk, and we'll sign off the official podcast bit now. And yeah.
Pleasure to talk to you, Ken.
Oh, it's great to see you, Joe.
Yeah.
Um,